Welcome back again to Red Star Radio. This is a historic moment. You join us this week as we stare into the trash can, which is inside an abyss, which is inside a vortex, and that vortex has a name above it, and that vortex is called capitalist culture. Big, symbolic meanings I'm attaching to all of these things. It's meant to make you feel an existential sense of dread, like you're being pulled down into an abyss, accompanied only by Marvel movies, reality TV shows, and the contents of every Super Bowl halftime show since 1990. But fear not, because myself and my indomitable host here, Layla, we are here to guide you through the maze inside the trash can, inside the abyss, and perhaps find the end of this rather tortured and elasticated metaphor that I've engaged myself in. So, this week is all about culture and aesthetics under capitalism, and we say hello again to our Canadian co-host. Hello, Layla.
Hello, hello.
And so, why don't we say, first of all, why we decided to do this and why we thought it was important to look at culture and aesthetics under capitalism. Do you want to start off by saying a little bit about that?
Well, I think we both got a little bit more interested in it after we saw the halftime show, the recent one. And we both had, kind of different thoughts on it. I thought it was a really good representation of late stage postmodern capitalism, and you had some thoughts about the difference between late capitalist spectacle and maybe this kind of spectacle that fascists used to put on for during that time. So it really made me think about the kind of art that's being produced, and the halftime show is kind of like the high art of capitalism right now, and I think it very much is representative of art writ large in the time that we live in. And so we're going to look at it through a Marxist perspective and understand, why this kind of art is being produced and what it means.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why it's important to do this is because not just that Layla and myself are aiming for very highly paid careers in the culture industry, more on that later, but culture and aesthetics is how a lot of people experience and understand the world on a day-to-day basis. It's what we come to see the world almost through. So it is important to understand it. And one thing I wanted to emphasize at the start was how the Marxist analysis that obviously we're going to be using to hopefully illuminate this starts from the understanding that everything flows from the material base of society. In this case, the material base of society is the capitalist mode of production. That's how our society produces and reproduces itself. And therefore, culture inevitably flows from that. And the changes in the material base of society, the changes in the way that capitalism produces commodities or produces other things as well, that reflect into the culture, sometimes for the better, sometimes in recent years we will argue for the worst. But do you want to start then to talking about just the what has been commonly referred to as the postmodern moment, why we are considered to be in it, and what the differences are, and how a theorist like David Harvey outlines that in the work that he did on it.
Yeah, so everything I'm about to say comes directly from David Harvey's excellent book, The Condition of Post-Modernity. So I know that Harvey has kind of lost the script in the last few years, but this is really one of the best books I've ever read. And he just makes a really convincing argument that culturally we've moved on from what he terms and others have termed modernity into a state of postmodernism, which is not so much a break with modernity, but a continuation of it, and one that emphasizes kind of the worst aspects of modernity. And so under modernity, modernity always was, it is a result of capitalism. It's a result of the creative processes and the destructive processes that are so intrinsic to capital's functioning. Its need to continuously innovate and, use a lot of creativity to pull itself out of the crisis that are intrinsic to capitalism. So there's a lot of destruction of old forms, but also there was a lot of innovation at the same time. And so this dialectical this dialectical reality of modernism was kind of counterbalanced by class struggle, which kind of extracted out of modernity its best aspects. So its creative aspects, its ability to push forward history, and taking things from the past and pulling it forward, and applying modern techniques to create something that was truly new, and truly innovative. So at this point, though, Harvey, and I completely agree with him, we've with the death of class struggle, which he kind of pinpoints at 1972. So he's more of an architect, kind of geographer. So that is the date when the Pruitt-Igoe housing development was demolished in St. Louis in the United States. But also a whole other slew of changes happened around that time. There was the oil shock in the United States and stuff like that. And also there was kind of the, final death throes of the labor movement throughout the world. Kind of, really hit a down point at that date. So post-modernity is kind of just the destructive aspects of modernity, and it's characteristic to kind of run things down and destruct old forms. That's all post-modernity really is, and it's so it's kind of like lost. It's like the condition of post-modernity has kind of lost the grand vision that modernity used to have about trying to rebuild using older forms, but kind of updating them with newer techniques. It's kind of lost that, and it's just a state of ephemerality. It's a state of
ephemerality.
Ephemerality. Thank you. It's the abandoning of a quest for synthesis and mastery. It's just it's a continuous anti-synthesis, and we're all kind of swimming in this fragmentary and chaotic changes that come about because capitalism must continuously destroy in order to function. And so what we have is an art and cultural paradigm, which is essentially like superimpositions of different realities from the past with no vision into the future, and a continuously quickening of time, and a continuously quickening liquidation of current forms in a way that just makes it very schizophrenic. Like it's completely lost any vision of the future, and its grasp of the past is very tenuous as well, because it just borrows little bits and pieces from it as it tries to reconstruct over its continuous destruction. But in that way, it only adds to the destruction. So I hope that wasn't too confusing, but that's kind of the shift that we're observing, and kind of the way that I view the current era.
So let's unpack a little from that. I want to give a couple of real world examples of how the postmodern condition, or the neoliberal period. I will use that term because it has a specific set of relations attached to it. Mm-hmm. How that is reflective of a generalized decay. And you mentioned there in your discussion of Harvey's point about the cannibalization, constant cannibalization, and this is what we've seen. Speaking specifically from a British perspective, you start to see cannibalization and the refusal to actually innovate and invest anything really starts to become obvious from the middle 60s onwards. One of the things you'll find that we return to constantly on this podcast is that the idea that in various capitalist countries there was a certain point reached 50 to 55 years ago or so, where capitalism's decay became obvious. And its decay became obvious because it was actually refusing to innovate and invest in new techniques of production. And it was refusing to do that because the returns weren't high enough. That's what the Marxists call the tendency of the rate of profit to fall manifesting itself. So how does this reflect into society and culture? I would argue that in the British case, you start to see a cannibalization for the purposes of accumulation. So you start to see the wholesale destruction of the manufacturing base in British society. It starts to gather pace in the late 60s, but really takes off after the middle 80s. And what effect does that have? Well, first of all, you suddenly see whole areas of the country reduced down to rubble, and then the land sold off cheaply, and what's built on it in the case of the economic development of this former industrial land is often quickly built, cheaply built, easy to throw up, easy to take down retail units. So famous case, it's a notorious zero-hour contract user, this company called Sports Direct in Britain. It built its warehouse in this place called Shirebrook in my home county of Derbyshire, where previously like a massive mining and industry complex stood, where people had worked in decently paid jobs for generations. Now people work on zero-hour contracts of barely minimum wage jobs, and they could be dismissed at any moment. There's no trade unionism. Everything is in a state of permanent flux for those people, whereas their parents or grandparents might have had relatively stable working class jobs there. And now I use that as an example because that's an example of permanent instability, permanent change. So like one retail unit will get thrown up, it lasts about 5 years, it goes bankrupt, it gets bought out, torn down, replaced with something else. That's what we're referring to as cannibalization. Nothing is created anew. There's no new productive activities going on. All that's going on is just a continual churn over to the lowest possible wage jobs possible, the easiest, most hyper exploitative commerce and industry, and that does echo into the realm of culture. How could it not? And it echoes into that in, again, I'm talking mainly in British terms, in terms of the disappearance of class struggle echoes up into the culture, because suddenly the elites are now the ruling class is now in a place where it's not being challenged. Therefore, it stops innovating entirely and starts to go rotten. And you can see that in every sphere of culture. You can see that in the British government always makes a big deal of its theatre sector. Well, truth be told, there's been no really innovative plays put on, certainly not in the regional theatre, not even really in the West End, other than revivals of things written 30 or 40, 50 years ago. You've just got a continual churn of older things being put on and revived again, or it's like a whole area of cultural production has been cut off. And it's no coincidence that has speeded up since the 1990s, that visible decline and fall of what they still tell us is this great British tradition, but we're just not producing anything there anymore. I'll talk more about film later, and we'll discuss television later, but it also reflects in terms of other visual arts as well. So like even stuff like you see there's an annual mock row in the media over the Turner Prize, this prestigious art prize, which is won by ever more ludicrous things. Like for instance, one year it was won by a guy who just painted a room white, made the lights turn on and off, and stuck a piece of chewing gum on the wall. Famously won by Tracy Emin's Unmade Bed. Not only is this stuff bad, it's something which it reflects just a profound lack of imagination, and all that comes out of a state where capital starts eating itself. And that specifically applies to the British case, but I think you can also apply that to most of the advanced capitalist nations.
Well, yeah, I mean, Harvey he kind of bases his whole discussion on the transition from what he terms Fordist accumulation to flexible accumulation. Whereas Fordism was based on kind of centralized planning, mass-consumed commodities, which called for a lot of standardization, and also a lot of a massive state spending in order to stabilize things, to make it stable enough to have these huge kind of production facilities and factories and stuff like that. We've moved onto a paradigm of flexible accumulation where it's small batch production. It's like more kind of individualized goods, or like the notion of individualized goods. And this has also been reflected in the way in which labor has changed as well. Like, so part of the reason why forwardist accumulation had to be so standardized and had to have so much planning and so much foresight is because the labor market was pretty inflexible because of higher, relatively high rates of unionization. So you couldn't shift like labor from one place to another very easily because of like union contracts and agreements and stuff like that. But now with the destruction of labor, it's a lot easier to just fire everyone and, replenish the reserve army of labor and then bringing them into another sector, which has allowed for this much more kind of demand-driven way of producing things. And so Harvey makes he makes the argument that this production model is reflected in art. And, as you're saying, you can see it everywhere in architecture, in movies, in visual arts and things like that. Like everything seems like it's just this pastiche of like that reflects the mode of flexible accumulation. So the fact that flexible accumulation doesn't really have any foresight, any vision to the future, and is always kind of looking it's to the past to see like what the demand is like. It can only see, kind of plan ahead just based on the demand that's coming up. So that by definition is from the past. It's always looking backwards, but it's never looking backwards very far, right? So that's what we also see in art. We see like kind of like this juxtaposition of different historical time periods kind of put on like in different historical time periods that have nothing to do with one another, that don't and the art forms don't seek to make any connections, but they're just superimposed on one another. And then there's usually this layer of like kind of contemporary pop art kind of added to make it all, to tie it all together. So it's not very cohesive, much like flexible accumulation isn't as well. So that's kind of how he has understood postmodernity.
Yeah, and so basically, if you're looking at if you're looking for an example of postmodern culture reflected in sort of popular art, so I could name half a dozen films which would fit that. But one of the films that immediately sprung to mind is like some of the stuff that's been done to various effects, like some of the stuff that the British filmmaker Michael Winterbottom has done, where he's obviously playing with ideas of narrative, some of which is quite entertaining, some of which is bloody awful. But like, and you've got stuff like Sofia Coppola's Marie Antoinette, for instance, which is basically, it's a period drama about the French Revolution, but hey, here's Adam and the Ants on the soundtrack, and they're all going to sing along. Things ripped out of context, stuck alongside each other. Sometimes it can make for entertaining cultural product. I would argue that more often than not it doesn't. And as Layla's been explaining, that might look just something that some ludicrous artist has dreamed up, but if you trace the influences, all of this comes from a material base, because that's, as human beings, that's how we live, and that reflects in everything that we do. So looking then at a lot of people, both on the conservative side of things and a lot of people on the Marxist side of things, will all use terms like decadence, decay, cultural decay, or capitalist decadence. When conservatives talk about it, they're generally focusing purely on what we would term the superstructural aspects of it. In fact, conservatives always talk about cultural decay. It's one of their most defining parts of their critique, going all the way back to the French Revolution itself. But these days they talk about cultural decay in terms of, you'll see like Peter Hitchens talks a lot about it, and he argues that culture's become much more crude, much more based around sort of graphic needlessly graphic portrayals of sex and violence, and that it's all ultimately reflecting a society that's become very empty. Now, there are parts of that argument that I think maybe both of us would agree with, but how do we view capitalist decadence then? How are we, when we use that term, what are we thinking of?
Yeah, so capitalism is inherently irrational. It's driven by in the final analysis, it's driven by, I mean, it is driven by the need to accumulate, but the individuals involved in that process do kind of follow a not necessarily a rational path to achieving that process. It's not driven by any kind of, it's irrational in the sense that it's not driven by any broader plan to, subsist the needs of society. It's driven by the need to generate money, which is not necessarily a rational thing. What class struggle does is rationalize the system. It confronts capital. The labor movement used to confront capital and force it to, return back to reality and socialize some of the surplus that it's been exploiting. And so this drive to rationalize the system has now almost been lost through decades of attacks against organized labor, which started, almost as soon as modernity was beckoned back in 1848 or whatever. What we see now in a period of decadence is that now that the labor movement has been pretty much defeated at the moment, capitalism has no countervailing force to force it to be a bit more rational. But it also doesn't have any countervailing force to force it to be innovative. Because a big reason why capital innovates, in fact, the only reason it does anything, including innovation, is in order to increase profit. But when there is no class struggle, there's no kind of labor movement trying to extract higher wages or whatever from capital. It doesn't really need to implement new technologies and new techniques in order to raise profits. It will instead fall back on an easier mode or maybe a more straightforward mode and a less investment intensive mode of doing so, which is via the increase of the exploitation of absolute surplus, meaning, tried, tested, and true methods such as extending the working day, increasing the intensity of work, making work and labor more flexible and making jobs more precarious so that it's easier to fire and hire people, which makes an operation more profitable. So that's what capitalism now is falling back on. It's basically going backwards. Like all of the gains the labor movement was able to make over the decades of struggle are now being retrenched by capitalism as it's returning to this more primitive form of profit making.
So this is the background to what we're referring to as capitalist decadence. And just to add to what Layla's said there, that manifests itself in a variety of ways. It manifests itself also partly by a refusal to invest in new and innovative productive methods, especially when you can just, if the working class gives you too much trouble, thanks to the combined innovations of modern communications technology and the ability to travel around the world in 12 hours via the modern jet aeroplane, you can just send your production to China, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, name any country in Southeast Asia or maybe sub-Saharan Africa if you're feeling particularly adventurous, where you could shift production to and get it done at a quarter of the cost, if maybe less than that. And of course, what that means for the working class in the most industrialized and advanced nations, that what you're tossed into isn't this brave new world that particularly like the Tony Blair and Bill Clinton era New Democrats and New Labour promise, which is that everybody was going to be sitting on a laptop coding all day in this wonderful high-tech future. What's actually happened is that the working class more and more is tossed into the most low-skill, ultra-flexible, low-wage jobs. That's the actual future. So all of the sort of space-age sci-fi shit that the capitalists promised, none of it turned into reality, because the brute reality is that they need labour to be exploited at the most cost-effective way possible. And in the most cost-effective way possible is this ultra-flexible, low-wage, hire-and-fire employment model, which is all, when you look at like the British government's plan to revive the economy post-COVID, all that is in there is like stuff that's straight out of Marx's section in Capital Volume 1 on extending the working day, making sure that people turn up earlier, leave later, and then carry on working if you can possibly get them working on their phones or on computers, either on their way to work or when they get to home, if that's possible. So all of this is what births our culture. So when we say it's decadent, this is the reason why, because we see capital as having outlived by at least 50 years. There's an argument that it's possibly back to World War One, but we'll have that on another day. There's for at least 50 years that capital has become now just a wholly unproductive system. That it's just engaged in sort of constant churn just to keep itself afloat. And one of the ways in which it does that is the predominance of fictitious capital. And what that means is, and we've talked about this before, but to recap, the huge amount of supposed money that is in the coffers of major capitalist institutions these days, be it banks or companies that are supposedly producing something, is capital which has not been accumulated via the exploitation of labor or the selling of any or taking of any commodity to market. It is just it is capital based purely on financial engineering, and that started to grow particularly from the 70s, but it has absolutely gone through the roof in the last 20 years. And it's something which, if you look at the activities of the central banks in London or Washington, D.C., the Bank of England or the Federal Reserve, they are continually supporting these gigantic bubbles of fictitious capital via continual programs of quantitative easing. And when you have now a large section of the economy resting very uneasily on the twin bubbles of fictitious capital on the one hand and gigantic amounts of debt on the other that can never be repaid, that chronic instability feeds into the situation we were describing, where all that capital is doing is turning itself over and making sure those gigantic bubbles are kept inflated. That's not a situation which leads to either economic or cultural innovation. Have I summed that up fairly there?
Yeah, and I just want to touch on this point, the importance of finance in the postmodern era, so our contemporary era. Before the ascendance of world finance, which is so key to the functioning of just-in-time production, because it enables companies to move around the world and hire different workforces and be able to pay them and then collect payments from different places around the world too in different currencies, etc. It's as key as the telecommunications technologies and the declining transportation costs that are necessary in that process as well. Before that era, there was a lot more state spending. And as states sought to stabilize stabilize labor markets as well as consumer markets, so that companies that were involved in these in Fordist production could depend on the fact that there would not be very severe there was always crisis, but it wouldn't be that severe that they couldn't depend on the fact that there would be consumers to buy their stuff once it was created, because it was all kind of done in big batches. So now the state has moved away from, it's withdrawing from public spending, and now it's focusing on stabilizing the driver of flexible accumulation, which is the financial markets. And so this withdrawal of the state, I think very straightforwardly contributes to the decline in art, because part of the stuff that part of what the state used to support was, of course, art, and it used to financially support artists and art making to a much greater degree than it does now. But yeah, so when you have when you have an economy that's no longer based on the production of, that's no longer focused on stabilizing the real world, and whose production has been so swelled by fake stuff. So fictitious capital is not real. It's basically it's capital that is premised on the idea that something will be created in the future. So it's not actual present production. So
Yeah, if they tried to spend all of this, the economy would collapse. Just like if people tried to claim back all the debts that were owed, the economy would collapse. And many of the big companies, like Tesla, for instance, can never pay back all the loans it's taken out, all the stock it's offered out. If you tried to do it, the whole system would just implode.
Yeah, exactly. And so you don't have an economy. There's always going to be a productive base that's creating real commodities. That's never going to go away under capitalism. But it's been so swelled by this fake capital stuff. And so you have a culture that is derived from a base that's swelled with like finance capital, which is completely irrational. It's completely based on like it's more irrational than a casino because it stops being based on mathematical laws of probability, and it becomes based on like bankers' kind of intuitions of what other bankers are thinking, and it's very, very far removed from objective reality, from physical reality. And so the culture itself becomes quite irrational and liquid, and it gains all of the characteristics of the base on which it kind of arises.
Yeah, so we've talked there for a while about why the base is important to actually understanding where the culture comes from. Because it's important to understand that, to see that this isn't just things that are happening in a void. This isn't just happening because the elites have woken up one day and got to the point where they've decided to produce like the worst derivative crap possible. This is all coming from a material point. And what we've done there is we've gone through and elucidated on that. But now we're going to go into looking at some specific examples of how this is reflected into real-world culture, how this unstable, irrational, and degenerated economic base reflects in the cultural world.
So you said that you watch a lot of what we call movies, British people call film. So how have you seen the progression of film in recent times?
Well, the obvious point that most people reflect to is that the output of Hollywood now is just basically like gigantic, mega budget, very shallow action movies, or like made by the paint by the numbers superhero films, which is obviously true, but it doesn't tell you anything about where it came from. Many people who are more adept at film analysis than I am would argue that certainly in purely American terms, the high point is reached in the early to middle 1970s, and then you start to go on a downward spiral from there. But why is that? Now, my argument is that progressively since what was kind of a high point of what some people call auteur cinema is probably the middle, or possibly maybe up to the late 1970s.
Wait. What's auteur cinema?
Auteur cinema. It's cinema driven by a powerful creative vision from usually a director. So you got like where it's the idea that a director's name alone can open a film. So like a Hitchcock movie back in the at any time really from the 30s through to the early 60s, his name on something would guarantee it certainly a large audience because of his reputation as a director.
So would you say that film used to be run by more of a kind of a grand vision theory of filmmaking?
It's always under capitalism, it's always a series of twists and turns and compromises.
Sure.
But in that earlier period, you certainly got a degree more of artistic freedom. And I think that was derived partly because of the difference in the economic base in the earlier to middle part of the 20th century that we've just outlined. And also the fact that you had more film studios competing with each other. Now, that, of course, film studios are run on very capitalist bases. compete with each other, buy one another out. Some go bankrupt, some rise again. But there was generally more competing with each other in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And then you start to see a relentless monopolization coming from the 80s through to today, where really there's like 3 or 4 left. And so, yeah, you did get a period where certain directors made names for themselves. So you get like Alfred Hitchcock, you get John Ford, the famous filmmaker who gave birth to like John Wayne's career and gave us some sort of the seminal scenes that came to be associated with the Western genre. Even over in you get it to a certain degree in other places as well, like the films of like Yasujiro Ozu in Japan, or the various other directors that working in that same period. And you get it in Britain as well, like you get like the until the middle 50s you got the films of Michael Powell or Hitchcock himself, who was obviously from here. And then you get people coming immediately after that, the sort of new Hollywood directors, like typified by the likes of Martin Scorsese, Brian De Palma, guys like that, who derived a lot of inspiration from movie makers like Hitchcock, like John Ford, like Howard Hawks, people like that, and took that to a new level. So you get like the very edgy, sometimes quite vicious, violent, exploitative films made by like Scorsese and De Palma, many of which I would argue are quite brilliantly done in the way that they portray like very brutal storylines sometimes, like famously or infamously the likes of Taxi Driver, or like a phenomenally underrated and also very uncomfortable film to watch like Scorsese's The King of Comedy, featuring probably a career best performance from De Niro when he still gave a shit. Now all of that gets made at a time when you still have a degree of freedom for these film directors whose, again, especially with like the likes of Scorsese, whose name can still to this day generate a level of interest in a film based on just his attachment to it alone. But equally so, when that wave crests by the early 80s, then you start to see it slowly move backwards, and it takes some time as the studios start to concentrate ownership more and more into a few hands. And then after the mid 1990s, you see in the United States a phenomenal concentration of both culture and media ownership around a few big companies. So before he sold it off, of course, you had Rupert Murdoch's Fox, which dominated in it was a huge player in films through 20th Century Fox, was a huge player in news and television, television programming. You get like Warner Brothers, you get various other companies that all concentrate together to film these gigantic monopolies covering everything from television news to what you see in a cinema screen. And that concentration goes along with a slow but relentless decline in the ability of film directors to produce something interesting. And Zizek makes this point a lot in his work when he talks a lot about Hitchcock, and he obviously goes into great depth about Hitchcock's work and the symbolism in it, etc. But one of the points he makes over and over again was that the Hitchcock's movies were not obscure art movies. These were movies which all made a lot of money, certainly up until maybe the early 60s when he peaked and kind of declined a little. But in the 30s, 40s and 50s, this guy was big money. It wasn't just that the studios were suddenly taking a liking to a particularly esoteric filmmaker. It was that this guy brought in huge amounts of money for them. But these were films which were made on a fairly mid-range budgets by the standards of the time. So what you start to see eliminated as capital concentrates all these studios is those movies that were of that mid-range budget, but which also had a degree of mass appeal, but also contained within them interesting ideas, interesting symbolism. It could be interpreted in interesting ways, provoked interesting responses from the audience. And that withdrawal of the ability to make those kind of films that could be commercially viable, that is reflective of a withdrawal of culture and its withdrawal of it being accessible to working class people, and also a withdrawal to a highly individualized consumption of art and culture. So, for instance, you might get a whole different range of people going to see a Hitchcock movie 50 years ago, 60 years ago now. But now that is not available, you'll be getting what? Somebody will watch like a very obscure, low-budget movie released through a streaming service on their own at home, particularly now. Whereas the cinemas, even before the COVID shutdown, were dominated almost purely by these sort of mass-budget spectacle pieces. And that mid-range movie that was still there until maybe the mid-90s has almost completely disappeared now as a product of the Hollywood system. So I'll pause there because I've talked for quite a long time.
Yeah, so would you say therefore that the main issue with film nowadays is that there isn't enough room for creative experimentation?
I think there's room for creative experimentation, but only if you do it on like an absolute micro budget. So, and then of course it doesn't get the release that would take it to a wider audience. But in terms of like, if you're hired to make like a big action movie or a superhero movie, you're basically just there to paint by the numbers. You're given, I mean, notoriously so, you're given like the producers give you a formula. It's like, right, you need to make sure that this, and this happens. And then maybe you could throw in a couple of individual touches, but basically this film's already written. We just need to make you to say action and make sure the camera's pointing in the right direction. So that's not, a real freedom of expression. That you're hired to supervise a production, which was going to happen whether you're there or not. So the importance of the director has really declined and gone out of the window. You wanted to jump in?
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say that that makes sense within the context of monopolization, because when you monopolize stuff, you reduce the competition involved. And part of the reason why modernity was so innovative is because there was so much competition. And the artists had to really strive to create art, that would garner a monopoly price. So something that was truly unique, and original. And so, yes, that created art that was highly individualistic and, disdainful of pop culture and not necessarily in touch with, like broader kind of society, but at least it did create innovative art. And it seems to me like what I'm hearing with film is that as studios have become more monopolized, like this drive for innovation coming from competition has been all but eliminated.
Yeah, because monopoly now just basically covers huge areas, as I was saying, of cultural production from movie studios to news studios, the drive for innovation has almost completely dried up. And the big studios essentially have a captive market, or did do in the cinemas before the COVID shutdown. What that's going to look like going forward, I can only speculate. But the likelihood is it gets even more boiled down to an individualized experience, which people are going to experience on their own. What's really died is the idea of this sort of cross-class, cross-cultural creativity that would be stimulated in an earlier period. That just isn't there now. Everything is an individualized cultural experience or cultural consumption experience.
Yeah, you know what? I think a lot of that is reflected in architecture as well. So I don't have as much to say about it as you do on film. But I will say that modernist architecture, for the first time in human history, was seeking to break out of aristocratic aesthetics and create something that was new, not only new, but that would serve the wider public in a way that was rational and that served like higher democratic purposes. So a really great example of this is Toronto City Hall, which I think is one of my favorite buildings in the world, alongside the Getty Museum in Los Angeles. The architect when you read about his thought process, it was a Swedish architect called Vigil Revel. He's really carefully thinking through how can we make this space, the city hall, not just aesthetically pleasing, but also a true political space. So when you go to City Hall in Toronto, there's a skating rink, and there's a huge kind of public kind of concrete area where they have festivals and protests and all these different social events. You have the council chambers, which is it's like the circular structure at the middle. So the whole idea was that, you could kind of walk in and you look down into the council. And so the idea was like, the people were, surveilling the politicians so that they would stay accountable to them. And you also have gardens at kind of like a mid-level roof at City Hall where people can enjoy nature. So this kind of grand vision in architecture has been completely lost within postmodernism. One of my favorite architects is Mies van der Rohe, who was a socialist as well. One of the high-rise kind of glass buildings that you see all over the world were in part due to his kind of pioneering work in that domain. He conceived his architecture as, quote, the will of the age conceived in spatial forms. So in the past, modernist architectures especially were seeking they had a grand vision for society. Like they wanted to, encapsulate, take it a moment in time in modernity and grasp it in its actuality, and then give it back to the people for its use. Whereas postmodernism isn't really seeking to do that anymore. It's more about it's more about, just pure aesthetics, just playfulness, like, just kind of trying new things and having all these little details that don't really make sense, but are kind of, pleasing to the eye in some ways. The whole kind of functionalist intent behind modernist architecture has been lost within postmodernism. And it's just because you don't have the same kind of class pressures anymore. When modernism kind of reached its high point, it was because it was post World War II and I. People were coming back into war-torn, aging cities, and there was a real class pressures to rebuild, to reorganize transportation systems, build factories, hospitals, schools, and adequate housing for, what was a potentially restless working class. And so this really drove, the modernist architecture's focus on functionality. So form follows function is kind of the big, there was a big thing. There's a big kind of guiding philosophy within like Bauhaus and, Gropus and all these different modernist architecture schools. And so I find that postmodernist architecture has kind of lost its focus on functionality. And I think this is in part due to the fact that absent class pressure, architecture has been taken over by market imperatives. So the cheapest things possible are built with the cheapest materials, using the lowest possible standards that they can manage. There isn't any more thought as to how we can create human living spaces. A really great building in Canada is Habitat 67, which is in Montreal. The architect there wanted to create, he placed his corridors kind of in between the different sections of the building, and they are all glass. And his whole idea was that he wanted people to come and walk through the corridors in order to admire the Saint Laurent River that is beside which the building is placed, and then meet one another and make connections, right? And you see these kinds of intents like all over modernist architecture, which is completely gone in postmodernism. There isn't any more grand vision. There isn't any more like aspiration to, bring art back to the people through the production of beautiful buildings. And yes, a lot of people don't like modernist architecture anymore and they really hate brutalism. But it's important to remember that when these buildings were built, like, for instance, City Hall, we have an old City Hall, which is done in an Edwardian kind of Victorian style, so kind of aristocratic style. And at the time when new plans were being drawn up for the new City Hall, so our current City Hall, that building was considered like oppressive and difficult to use, and there was no space for anything, and it was, so kind of old-fashioned, and people really didn't like it. And when the new City Hall was unveiled, it was like, an event. It was like so popular. People loved it, right? So aesthetic preferences change and have changed with the changing of, the productive base. And so yeah, like I think obviously, like I think a new synthesis is required for architecture. Like it was never really for truly a modernist architecture was never truly a product, by and for the people. It was always in the hands of these, kind of visionary architects. But I think at least that intent was there. And now I think in a lot of art, that intent is lost. Like there's no more aspiration to create great and, to capture a moment of time and create something infinite that would last through time and through the violent changes that were part of modernity. There is no more aspiration to do that anymore. And that's why everything doesn't last. Like it's all a very ephemeral, like the postmodernist buildings break down so quickly. So I think architecture really captures the moment in time, and definitely postmodern architecture does for sure.
So you're saying that even though the modernist architects are often people who have come from very ruling class backgrounds, the economic and social weight of the labouring class, the labour movement, has a clear impact upon their work in that early to middle 20th century period, in the way that they designed buildings and the way that they saw their own mission.
Yeah, exactly. And like I think a lot of that pressure came, in fact, from the Soviet Union, who really trailblazed different architectural methods and building and housing building methods. Like for instance, they're the ones who really started the whole prefabricated parts, because they needed to build a lot of housing really quickly as the peasantry was moving into the urban areas and becoming the proletariat. So they really need to build a lot of housing really quickly. And so they thought up of this way of prefabricating parts of housing so that they could create a lot of good quality housing very quickly. And also the Soviets, unlike, I don't know if I'm sure it exists somewhere, but they're one of the first states to say, people need space. Like people need enough space to live in. So they had minimum space requirements in each of their apartments per person. Yes, that wasn't always achieved in the end, but now we have buildings in Toronto, for instance, that are built, they're 300 square feet. It's tiny. It's not enough space for anyone to live, let alone a couple, let alone a family. There's no thought. There's no more pressure to build things for the future, to build things for someone who will, one day have a partner and then have kids and, need the space for that. Like there's no kind of grand vision anymore. And it's because architecture, like every other kind of art, is just based on profit making, which is irrational. Having more profit doesn't mean that it's good for humanity. Oftentimes the opposite. And there's no more working class to pull capital back in at least a little way and force it to serve real needs versus, profit production.
Yeah, and I wanted to mention there about housing in particular, because if you look at the housing developments in central Manchester, the place where I've lived and worked for much of the last decade, and this is reflected in many other British cities as well, that there's a myriad of new housing developments. They're constantly building new flats, new apartments, etc. And I've lived in some of these places. I lived in one sort of pseudo space age apartment in Salford Quays, which is this sort of post-industrial redevelopment site in the city of Salford. And it was this very, very futuristic looking glass building with like a giant canopy on the roof, and there was a long architect's statement when I first looked at moving in there, saying that the canopy on the roof is meant to be representative of the old sailing ships that used to come up the Manchester Ship Canal to Salford docks. Of course, didn't look anything like that, but clearly there was meant to be some sort of vision in there. But what ultimately was built was something which was these tiny pod living places where the individual living space was tiny. It was like with a fold down bed in it and a sort of tiny cubicle bathroom and a tiny kitchen area. It was literally built for one person and one person only. Of course it didn't last. As soon as you brushed the wall, the plaster started falling off. And that wasn't just a product of just that particular development. Like other places I'd lived in, where like you would lean on the wall and it would wobble. And this was in a building that was only like 6 years old. And broader than that, like some of the places I've worked in, where like there's this famous building in Manchester called the Civil Justice Centre, where a lot of civil servants are based. I used to go in there for trade union work quite a lot. And it was this building that looked like a sort of partially falling over filing cabinet. Very interesting design, but you go in it, and this was only a building that was less than a decade old, and it was already dingy and falling apart. And it was not just that it was dirty; it was like the physical space was visibly diminishing and deteriorating around you and wasn't being kept up. So it had been built to obviously look impressive for about 5 minutes, and then it immediately starts decaying. Mm-hmm. So is that the kind of thing you're referring to when you talk about the lack of actual functionality that you have in these postmodern buildings?
Yeah, I really love. So Niels de Roo would always say less is more. Yeah. He would. I mean, people don't like his architecture that much. Maybe glass buildings, I don't like, but the point is, at the very least, you can say that the buildings are functional. They're made, to last. And you superimpose that with one of postmodernism's biggest architect, Venturi, who said less is more, right? So
so clever.
Yeah, it's like this very kind of superficial view of what things are for, like what buildings should be about. I think that postmodern architects, they kind of view their they don't really see their role anymore as servants of the people, right? They see themselves as postmodern artists, essentially, who are just kind of and very kind of like, they think that that an achievement is being playful and, achieving something idiosyncratic. You know what I mean?
Empty pretension.
Yes, exactly. Whereas, and as you're describing like this falling apart of buildings and the poor quality of buildings works very well with capital's need to continuously sell more and more stuff. So the faster buildings can go into a state of disrepair, the faster we can, build more buildings. But that's not good for people who seek a use value primarily out of their housing. In fact, they are not primarily buying housing just for the look of it. They're buying it because they want to live in it, because they want to, start a family, like live a life, right? And so I think the modernists were much more correct when it came to their philosophy of architecture, that form should follow function. And yes, I mean, it doesn't mean we have to have ugly buildings and like just, concrete boxes everywhere. And that's not what modernism, I mean, sometimes it was like that, but it wasn't always like that. But yeah, first and foremost, it should have a use value. That will last through at least a person's lifetime. Like the condos that are being built in today's cities, they won't last 10 years. They're being in Toronto. We have our buildings insulated with a noble gas called xenon, which seeps out of the pipes in which it's in within 10-15 years. So in 10-15 years in Toronto, we're going to have insulated buildings in a country that's extremely cold during the winter. It's just completely irrational. It's crazy.
Yeah, the only way it makes sense is in the sense of creative destruction.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think modernity was always creative. It was always about creative destruction, but at least there was this move to create as well. But now I feel like it's just basically just destruction. Like it's just creating to destroy. Whereas modernity sought to kind of take a breath out of the torrents of destruction and kind of encapsulate that, at least for a moment, like there was, and I think that, that is kind of like the Marxist kind of project is taking the productive forces that are wrought through this process of competition and putting it into the hands of the proletariat so that they can put it to human use. So taking a hold of the reins of modernity and of history and putting it to use for the good of all mankind, right? And so I think there was moments of that in modernity. There was moments of trying to do that because of the class pressures at play, which is gone now.
Yeah, so what perhaps maybe the best way to see modernity is that it's a moment in history, maybe several decades in history, where the power of the organized working class is actually able to restrain the destructive and irrational profit-seeking nature of capitalism to reach some, albeit temporary, position of, if not equilibrium, then at least another side to the tug of war.
Yeah, I mean, it was exactly. It was, it was a struggle of who would take hold of history, right?
Yes.
And who would bring it forward. And I think when you see the bourgeoisie leading history, because they are a historically dead-end class, they cannot move it forward. They can only move backwards. And so I think that's why, we're stuck in like this holding pattern, like these cycles of things happening, like for instance in film, like very repetitive movies that just kind of go over the same thing over and over again, maybe with like an aesthetically different sheen to it, but it's nothing really innovative. Like, so I just watched the Emma remake, for instance. And it wasn't, it was, I love this stuff, so don't get me wrong, but like, it was basically like a millennial take on Emma. It was a lot of irony, a lot of kind of subdued color palettes, like, the kind of millennial characteristics to a Jane Austen classic, but it wasn't anything new, it was just kind of same old, but aesthetically like little differences that made it new enough to remake. So yeah, I think that's basically like how a lot of art is now as well.
Well, yeah, and you also get that reflected, and this leads us nicely into our questions over the fate of television. Like, if you pull up any of the streaming services, which everybody's been stuck in front of for months after months under the less lockdown, sort of more curfew arrangements, you see on there, even like the massive shows on like something like Netflix, like everybody was raving about that King's Gambit, the chess thing.
Queen's Gambit.
Queen's Gambit, of course, because it's all about ladies' empowerment for chess. That in itself is set in like over 50 years ago. It's representative of a trend towards where they keep making these shows not about even the modern era, about 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. And whether the writer or the producer or whoever the driving force behind it knows it or not, they're all grasping backwards for a time where things seem to make more sense. I think the constant reaching back into the past, culturally speaking, is a desperate grab trying to grab onto something more concrete than what you get now in culture, which is no future, no past, just an ever-changing present.
Yeah, I mean, being innovative was always so challenging to be innovative. Like, you have to make you need the room to make mistakes in order to innovate. Like, 99 things out of the 100 you try will be bad, but that is necessary for the process of creativity.
Yeah, you have to be allowed to fail.
Exactly. And when you're not allowed to fail, then you need to stick with what you know will work, which precludes innovation. With television, I mean, I don't watch that much TV. I watch a lot of I don't like Netflix. I find it's really bad. But I think like with TV, like I think it's kind of like the perfect technology for postmodern art. Because let me just go to my notes here. Where is it? It's, it's like the era of mass television is it's an attachment to surfaces rather than roots. It's intrinsically a collage rather than an in-depth work. You're superimposing, quoted images rather than, physical surfaces that you've worked on. And it definitely collapses time and space, much like post-modernity does, right?
Yeah.
Rather than create and generate a solid, cultural artifact. And so I think that television is the perfect method of delivering postmodern culture and art to people. Because not only does it have all of the aspects of postmodernity encapsulated in its technological function, but it also it's mostly watched in a kind of socially isolated way, and always has been, right?
Yeah.
You might sit around the TV with your family and watch something. Definitely we did a lot of that growing up. But now more and more, as TV has shifted over to the computer, people are doing so alone. And it really has degraded the culture in a lot of ways. Not only by force feeding people postmodern culture, which is so bad, but also by socially isolating them even more than they are usually in their leisure time. So I'm very skeptical as to the value of television. I'm sure it could be done in a way which is more social, wherein better things are created, better TV shows and series and stuff like that are created. But it's no replacement. Capitalists would like us to believe that electronically delivered culture can replace real life culture. That, watching a symphony on YouTube is just as good as the real thing, And that is a lie. That is a myth. There is no camera that has as much acuity, for instance, as the human eye. And it's difficult to explain what is different about a real life, going into a museum and seeing a work of art face to face and being able to observe the textures of the paintbrush and, being around people who are also admiring the work. And, you can't explain what's different about that experience, but it is different.
Yeah, you can't quantify it precisely, and that maybe is the point.
Yes. And I think that this move towards television and the move towards individual consumption via computers is extremely capitalistic. It's very bourgeois. And the thing is, the bourgeoisie doesn't accept it for themselves. They buy expensive pieces of art to decorate their homes and stuff like that. They're not satisfied to just, a lot of galleries are putting their collections online so you can click through art and, see it from home or whatever during the pandemic. But they don't accept that. They want the art. They want the real thing, And I think that the proletariat also deserves the real thing, because after all, the productive labor and the unproductive labor of the proletariat is what makes these things possible.
That's exactly the case. And the television is really the ultimate delivery system for capitalism, or more, and for certainly capitalists' recreation of its values. Because what are you doing? You're in older times, and 30 years ago, you're sat there silently watching some form of entertainment or news or culture with your family. Now you're sat on your own in your room, or on your own in your postmodern nightmarish falling down flat, watching something on Netflix completely on your own. You are a completely atomized subject, and you are that culture is being delivered to you, or more to the point, at you, and you are not in any way engaged with it. Not really. You're a passive receiver of it, and that's a different thing to going and actually experiencing something not only in person, but also experiencing it as a collective. So you're having your individual interaction with either a concerto, an opera, a piece of a portrait painting, or a piece of theatre. Or let's go further. Let's go into the world of mass sporting culture as well, like the experience of actually going and watching a football game live is very different to watching it on the television. Experiencing all of these things with a mass audience, which you are a part of, and feeling the collective emotion running through that, then that's also a key part of it. And that's something, of course, the bourgeoisie keep for themselves very much. They love their gallery openings, etc. But they're much less keen on the mass crowds of the working class enjoying anything. In fact, they're deeply suspicious of it.
Yeah. And it comes back down to the fact that bourgeoisie cannot conceive of a totality. They are not able to, like, they can only see things from their own point of view, their own very limited class perspective. Whereas the proletariat is the universal class, so they can see things from humanity's perspective, like as such, right? And so, this, like, Brecht was a really famous Soviet playwright, and he talks about the dialectic of theater, about how having to go in and having to experience theater as a social, like as a collective, and then like collectively trying, like, so theater is kind of, it's not like movies and films and stuff in that it can't really do special effects or anything, right? So you have to kind of use your imagination to fill in the blanks in a theater, right? In a theater show. Yeah. And he talks about how that as a collective kind of activity in which he sought to teach people different things, right? And he sought to expand the critical and dialectical capabilities of the people, right? So what they're like, not only has the bourgeoisie lost any kind of grand vision for art, any kind of effort to make art go above and beyond and reveal higher truths or teach people something, or touch on the sublime or anything like that. They've also depleted it of its the collective kind of aspect of it in terms of going to see and experiencing art together. So as you were saying, because movies are so individuated now, there isn't any such thing, or hardly, there are very few such things as a cultural event that everyone takes a part of, everyone is aware of, everyone talks about, everyone learns something from. Like, there isn't anything like that anymore either. And then people don't get together anymore. And so it's just so individuated and socially isolated, and it's really awful. It's quite a depletion of culture.
Yeah, and one thing that the previous year that's just gone by has made me appreciate more is that for about 8 years I lived about 10 minutes away from the home of the Manchester orchestra. They're called the Halle Orchestra, and I only went like twice, maybe 3 times in about 8 years, and suddenly I appreciate the accessibility of that a whole lot more. Now I can't go. Now it's impossible for me to go. Now I can't go to like even the fairly limited art galleries inside Manchester or the wider English Northwest. Suddenly you start to think, well, yeah, I wish I'd done more of that. I wish I'd actually spent more time just contemplating various pieces of artistry, because perhaps it does reveal a higher truth. Perhaps it's just pleasing to look at. Who knows? But I would say one thing that, like, because I grew up at my parents would like take me to galleries, and my mother in particular would point to things and go, "Look there, that's good. Now you should like that." And of course, being a teenage boy, it's like, no, it's all terrible, or hate it all. But one experience that changed all that was when suddenly, like, after years of not going in art galleries, I just was in London one day and I walked into the National Portrait Gallery and I actually saw one piece of artistry which really underlined to me the power it can hold, and that's a piece by a portrait painter from the 19th century called Elizabeth Thompson. It's a piece called Balaclava, and it's the survivors of the ill-fated charge of the Light Brigade in the famous war between the British and the Tsarist Empire. And there's a figure in the foreground, and he's walking. If it was a camera shot, he'd be walking towards you. But what the artist does is capture an absolutely dead, sort of shell-shocked look on the surviving soldier's face, which gripped me in a way that I didn't anticipate. And from that moment onwards, I've actually grown an appreciation for all the things that my parents told me that I should appreciate. And it was in that moment, just looking at it and staring at it directly in person, that I got that. You would not get that by doing a Google search or doing an online tour. You have to be there in person for a piece of art to actually have that impact upon you.
Yeah, and I there's so many great stories like that of people. I was listening to an artist speak to how he, after he lost his mother, he was in a gallery and just looking at religious art, which is quite repetitive. It's the Virgin Mary, Jesus, blah blah blah. But he just came upon a painting of the Virgin Mary, and he just started crying, like he was because he had just lost his mother, and he connected that loss with that image of the Virgin crying as well over her lost son, and it transported him, like it was able to connect all these different experiences for him in this work of art, and that helps us understand. I think art can help us, uncover truth, right? Like, and I know that's not a strict Marxist understanding of art, but I do think that it can do that, and like art was never meant to be experienced electronically, and so you can't expect it to have those kind of effects if it is delivered through this electronic medium. I also lived near the Art Gallery of Ontario, which isn't like a huge gallery. It's not like what you guys have in the UK, but it's a nice little gallery. It's well curated. There's like a lot of great Canadian art pieces there, which is actually very good. And I used to go there all the time because it's cheap. Like, you can get a year membership for like $35. I used to go there all the time, and I used to draw. Like, I used to sit and draw the paintings, like, and draw them myself to get to know the paintings and stuff. Like, I was on this kind of, I wanted to understand art better, and that's one of the things I did to do so. And yeah, like, I think it's really overwhelming for a lot of people when they go into an art museum, because a lot of people don't have any instruction in art, and they are not permitted to explore art in any depth, and they're just kind of expected to kind of go on school trips to museums and, like your parents said, appreciate this, appreciate that, but you never know why, right? People need the time and the space and the instruction to understand what they are seeing and contextualize it within the history of art. And yeah, have time with it, to be playful with it, to experience it, so that they can make their own conclusions as to what art means for them and what they like and what they don't like. And people just don't have the time for that anymore. But I really think that it's a human right to be able to experience art in that way. It's a human heritage. It's part of our inheritance as the human race, like art and music and all these different things. And the fact that we're being cut off from it is not okay. Like, it's not okay that suddenly I can't go to libraries, I can't go to museums, I can't go to the symphony. Symphony's kind of expensive, so you can't go that much anyways. But, still, like, it's not okay that we're all cut off from these things, because they are our right, as humans.
Yeah, instead of which you're being drip-fed Netflix.
Yeah, and like, yeah, it's really perverse, because we're cut off from our human heritage, and then instead given this very bad replacement. It's not even a good replacement. like there is no replacement for real life art, but even the replacement at hand is so bad.
Well, you said there a very interesting thing which you've mentioned to me before, which is that art can contain a real, maybe a moment of truth. And would you say that is when there is a moment or an image or a note, perhaps, I don't know, that transcends the moment, and the person experiences something wholly new and unfiltered through capitalist realities? They experience something almost pure through a transcendental moment in art.
Well, yeah, I don't want to pretend to know about art too hard, but
Go on, that's what the whole podcast is about.
So basically kind of I would say modern understanding of what art is, so starting from Burke, going down to Kant and Hegel, is that art is a way of accessing the sublime, which is, according to Burke, a mixture of horror and of pleasure, but one that you can observe from a rational perspective. And so it's transcendent. It helps you transcend reason and moral judgment to another plane. It's like a mystical experience almost, like when Burke and the romantic thinkers like Burke would often think of one's experience encountering nature and encountering the sublime through nature. Hegel and Kant thought it was very accessible via art. And so nowadays when you go to a museum, and as I said, I would go all the time, and so I would see all the new exhibitions. And so a lot of time they would have contemporary art exhibitions, and you would go in and literally every single contemporary artist that I would see would at least have one installation that was just like garbage in a pile. And you were told to observe how this was reflective of consumerism, and to this day the AGO has a standing kind of exhibition that's contemporary art made in the 2020s and 2010s. That's just basically pieces of trash put together in different in different ways. And so there's nothing transcendent about that. I do think that is truth, because I think that is actually very accurate. Like that is modern day capitalism. Like we are living in a time of like almost pure destruction, and all we can like we're getting to a point where all we'll be able to observe is the destruction. No more creation, just destruction. So just trash. But like I think that art used to be, the artist from definitely religious art and the Renaissance art, and even a lot of modernist art, of course, was seeking to extract the truth and present the truth and help you experience the truth, even if that truth was momentary, because it would be destroyed very soon under the pressures of modernity. They wanted to deliver it to people to observe and understand, right? And so you got a lot of weird stuff coming out of that, like cubism and abstract art and things like that. But those were still efforts of getting at the truth, at least. Like, we have our different kind of aesthetic preferences and whatever. You can say what you will about it, but it was still, that effort was still there. And I just find that contemporary artists, like there's still a few good ones like that will rise now and again that will kind of show you something, especially when it comes to technology. A lot of kind of new techno, kind of like what does technology mean to our lives type Heidegger approaches are pretty popular right now amongst artists, but most of it is really not good. It's only looking inwardly. It's not seeking to transcend the current reality of postmodernism, because it can't, and there's no pressures for it to do so.
Yeah, it's just staring at the pile of trash and saying, "Hey, look at the trash." It's not actually encouraging the viewer or the experiencer of it it's not encouraging you to reach beyond that. It's just literally saying, here's a pile of shit. Isn't that good? It
literally, like, it seems like this is a joke, but that's literally what a lot of art is. It's just trash. It's not even in a metaphorical sense. Like, it's literally trash in the middle of the museum in a pile, and we're told to admire how it's such a great representation of consumerism or whatever. It's really bad. It's sad to see.
You hate to see it, to quote a popular phrase.
You do hate to see it.
You certainly hate to experience it. So if the postmodern culture is reflective of the degenerated state of capitalism, therefore is a literal pile of shit on the floor in a museum, or like some god-awful Netflix drama usually involving Mexican drug barons or something like that, then what could be a culture of the future? So how has the working class movement, the old international socialist and communist movement, what have been the representations of art, for instance, there? So a couple of examples just to throw in here. Under the Soviet Union, you got right up until the end a huge level of experimentation in film. You got like the films of Andrei Tarkovsky, for instance. You got other filmmakers, even right back to the earliest period, like likes of Eisenstein, doing these huge breakthroughs in the art of cinema. I mean, Eisenstein's shot rendering, shot selection would be basically ripped off by every other, or homaged by every other filmmaker from the rest of the world for the rest of the century. Like, even just one example, for instance, the shot in Battleship Potemkin of the pram being rolling down the steps, which has been repeated over and over and over again by British, American, French, all kinds of filmmakers. And then you get experimental films like Man with a Movie Camera in the early period of the Soviet Union. And a lot of that was underpinned by the fact that the state was actually prepared to fund artists to do really experimental stuff right up until near the end of it, which is far and away removed from the image of the Soviet Union as this sort of dour place where everything is censored to death. You actually got, through the state funding of the arts, a lot of artists from ordinary working class backgrounds were able to actually come in and then do a great deal of experimentation, which produced a huge variety of things, some of which worked, some of which didn't. So you got that scope for experimentation.
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the only things I know about film is that I really like Solaris and Stalker, which is I like sci-fi a lot, and there's so much sci-fi is so hard to get right, and it's done so poorly so often. But yeah, the Soviet Union really trailblazed when it came to that genre, and two of the most popular Hollywood films, sci-fi Hollywood films, is Aliens and of course Blade Runner. But that actually was, when you watch Solaris and Stalker, you can see how much they influenced those two films. Like especially Stalker. It's crazy. It's like it feels the same as Blade Runner. It's just really crazy. But these kind of innovative things, especially when it comes to science fiction, which is like probably on the leading edge of innovation, putting together so many, leading edge of science, as well as humans, meeting with the unknown. Like it is kind of an innovative genre. And I think that's why it's done so poorly often nowadays. But it was made possible because the USSR had a space for art that was secure, so that people could experiment and they could try different things. And I mean, I'm not a film buff or anything, but that was able to produce some really cutting edge stuff that Hollywood is still borrowing from today.
Yeah, and it's also worth mentioning that particularly when it comes to a genre like science fiction, the understanding of it has changed, and a lot of critics actually blame the influence of something like Star Wars for that. Whereas like the understanding of science fiction prior to the late 1970s, early 80s was less towards like effects driven spaceship movies, more into like the idea behind completely different beings and cultures suddenly meeting, and the
yeah, and also
and
also like how we can process the idea that there might be different worlds and different ontological realities as well, like and so it is so cutting edge, and yeah, like you're saying, it's been taken over by nice effects and stuff.
Yeah, which visually sometimes are very impressive, but then also sometimes you look at like something which is wholly based on computer generated effects, and it looks, not only does it not look real, the whole thing looks flat. So, for instance, like you get whole science fiction movies made in Hollywood, like the modern Star Wars movies, which are almost entirely CG, and the whole thing looks flat as a pancake. There's no tactile quality to it whatsoever. You don't believe that any of this is real. You don't suspend your disbelief for a moment. You look at that and you think, oh, there's a lot of pixels there. There's no, you never buy into it for a moment. There's no, the world that is being built there is just ultimately like a glorified computer game. You're not immersed in it at all. which makes all the arguments over which Star Wars is better or worse just utterly hilarious. It's just like, to use Borges, Jorge Luis Borges' term, it's, two bald men fighting over a comb.
Yeah, and I think it's because when you can only look inwardly, the only kind of art involved in that is trying to reproduce reality as closely as possible and try to make something seem real, So yeah. I think that the other aspects of science fiction, which I think are the more interesting aspects, which is an encounter with the unknown and the human interaction with that and how we process that, is kind of lost. They think that if they can aesthetically make it seem sci-fi, then it is. But that's not what sci-fi really is about, or should be about, in my opinion. Yeah, maybe not. Have I overstepped?
Well, no. I was just thinking that when you think about the even like science fiction novels from an earlier period, like the remarkable thing about them is that, Asimov, for instance, spends a lot of time talking about technical things about, we're traveling via the speed of light through this many dimensions or whatever. But a huge amount of like the Foundation series is focused on like the character-driven piece about what is these beings' responses to encountering these increasing levels of like sometimes near apocalyptic different realities, and the psychological impact you can have on that. So even in the weaker books of the Foundation series, like you'll have moments where like these people who have never been into space before are looking out, experiencing this interstellar travel and experiencing it almost as a religious thing. And it's not 37 pages spent describing the look of the hyperdrive or something. So to me, that is also like something profound that's been lost in modern science fiction. It's this, and it's not just that Asimov does it, it's just that Asimov's the ones I've read most recently. It's the sense of transcendental wonder in the characters when they're confronted with these realities which the human mind can barely encompass.
Yeah. Like I said, I think art should teach us truth, so show us truth or help us ascertain it. It's a different mode of doing that. And I think what science fiction could do is show us, like, we have a kind of a limited view of what it is to be human on the planet with the current technologies that we have, but what does it mean when we're encountering artificial intelligence, or when we discover that there's other beings outside of the planet? Like, what does that mean for the human condition, right? So I don't know, like it definitely isn't the most important thing, obviously, but I think that it's part of the human drive to be creative, to learn, to exercise one's rational capacities. And I think art is a really important part of that. It's an important part of being human, always has been. And it should serve like that human purpose. Like it, so in that sense, that is kind of a Marxist take on it, because art is at the service of humanity in that sense. Mm-hmm.
And that's why back in the early to mid 20th century, access to cultural and artistic facilities was always a demand of many trade unions in Britain. It was always a demand for the men and the women who were working in factories and mines and fields all day to be able to not only experience culture but also find a cultural side to themselves that their basic level of education would not have given them. So, for instance, there was stories of miners becoming really interesting portrait painters thanks to like the programs their trade unions set up. And these people who would never have found a cultural expression before, the ability of the union to organise that level of cultural education and access to cultural education gave them an outlet in terms of creativity which they would never have found otherwise. So clearly, when the working class movement has actually been at its strongest, it's recognised the profound impact and positive impact that a cultural education and expression can have to any human being. And it's something that the bourgeoisie very much seeks to keeps to itself these days.
Yeah, because it doesn't recognize the proletariat as properly human. They see the proletariat through quantitative terms only, and through their use for their continue their domination, right? So they don't see a person like a person, and see them for all of their complex needs as a social being, which is reflected in all of their policies. Like, of course, we've talked about COVID at length. But yeah, like when it comes to education, when it comes to what they think our leisure time should look like and things like that, it's inhuman. Like there's no other way of describing it. It's just an inhuman outlook.
Exactly. And this is why we wanted to do this and wanted to do a show specifically on culture, aesthetics and art, because this is an area which does not get the attention that it deserves from certainly from modern leftism. They're all too busy watching Netflix and telling each other it's a socialist experiment. But final point to cover in this week's episode, and it's the most important one of all, which is podcasting art? And are therefore we artists?
Well, I think that there is something sublime about understanding and being understood. I think there is a euphoria involved in that process. And so I'm going to say that while I can't say that podcasting is art as such, I definitely would say it's artistic. And any mode of conversation and of knowledge formation does have a undeniable element of creativity, and which I think could be characterized as artistic, and I stand by that. Am I an artist? I wouldn't say that, but I would definitely say, like every other human being, I am artistic.
Exactly. This is, we may not be artists, but this is potentially an artistic endeavour. Therefore, I am as we speak, filling out a form to the Arts Council asking for money, demonstrating how this podcast reaches various oppressed groups. But seriously, like the act of knowledge sharing and collaboration,
yes,
is always a semi-artistic process. I think it has artistic elements to it. And that's what makes collaboration one of the essences of our very humanity.
Yeah, I mean, collaboration brings together everything, especially when it's in person, having to collaborate with someone on a team. And I think that's something that, you and I, maybe not, I mean, myself, definitely as a person who works from home and who has an office job, I don't really get to experience a lot, but working people definitely who are always working together and in person, they do experience these moments of collaboration. And so I think that's why the proletariat, part of the reason why it is a universal class, because it does have this view into the completeness of the human, not only through their interests, their material interests, but also through their everyday collaboration with other human beings to get work done and move things forward. I think that especially during the pandemic, it's like being able to, I mean, it's not, I wouldn't say it's a privilege, but it definitely, I think it puts you in touch with reality in a way which is lost to so many people who coincidentally also make up all the propaganda in capitalism, like the journalists, the scientists, the politicians. They're detached from that reality, whereas the proletariat has not been writ large.
Yeah. And that brings us to the end of this week's Art, Culture and Aesthetics episode. As always, I hope that we've explicated our subject more to you, and at the very least you take away some of the points we've made here and think about them further, even if perhaps you vehemently disagree with us and love all the shows on Netflix, especially the ones about the drug barons. The podcast will be back next week, but I will conclude by saying that the cultural demand is still there, and the cultural demands of the working class should still be made as part of a working class program, because the derivative slop that the bourgeoisie throws at you these days potentially is very bad for your health. So with that conclusion and with that discussion, we will leave it there for this week. So it is goodbye until next week from me, and it is
See you next time.
from Layla over there in the frozen wastelands of Canada.